Is there such a thing as a painful blessing? We're going to explore the reality of suffering through the lens of the Bible's poetic books and learn why suffering grants us new vision of God Himself. First of all, what are the poetic books? They are the 5 books of poetry or wisdom in Scripture known as the book of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Songs. These books cover issues such as suffering, parenting, and the fear of the Lord, and they give us basic instruction for human living. Now, each of the 5 books is unique, however, they share some common attributes. For example, first of all, they all 5 explore the full spectrum of human emotions and relate to our real world experience. And second, the 5 poetic books have an extensive use of parallelism to communicate strong emotional truths. Third, the 5 books of poetry provide insight to life itself. They act as a guide for believers to live a meaningful and successful life, both with our relationship to the Father and one another. At bottom, the poetic books address practical life issues, offer moral guidance, and explore the meaning of life for every soul on this side of eternity. Now, Job is perhaps the least preached upon of the poetic books, and that is because suffering isn't desirable for today's believer. Still, each of us does in fact suffer, and oftentimes we don't know why. And my guess is when it's your turn to suffer, you're a lot like me. You just want to get to the point where it's gone. Now, Romans 8:28 says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. Now, let me ask you this. What if the purpose God has called you to is outside of your perceived dimension of understanding? What if God has called you to a season of intentional suffering for his glory? See, Job is a story that processes this painful reality. Because the truth is, there is such a thing as a painful blessing. Let's see what the book of Job can teach us. In summary, Job is a wealthy man and the head of a large family. In Job chapter 1, verse 1, he's referred to as perfect and upright. So much so that God calls Satan's attention to him. And the devil asks to afflict Job and is permitted to do so, not once but twice. Before long, Job begins to question why God would allow him, a good man, to suffer so severely. Job's suffering is compounded by his 4 friends, I'm using air quotes, who accuse Job of committing secret sin. In the end, God himself speaks to Job before his 4 friends, vindicating Job and also addressing the overarching issue of human suffering. Now, God doesn't address Job's suffering the way perhaps we would like him to, but rather God asks questions to Job that he can't answer, implying that Job, and you and I, should trust God's way. Job agrees with this in chapter 42, verse 2, stating, I know that thou canst do everything. In the very end, Job is restored, and a mighty blessing comes from God. God blesses Job to a level far beyond his initial holdings, and Job experiences what is known as a painful blessing. So as we end, let's quickly understand the 3 things you need to do when you're in the midst of receiving a painful blessing. Number 1, you need to understand that God has a purpose in allowing suffering to occur. Absolutely. In the moment, it's not fun. We universally agree that suffering isn't so much fun as it is purposeful. You need to understand that God has a purpose for all of your suffering. Number 2, God requires faithfulness of us when we suffer. The biggest question you ask in a time of suffering is, why, God? Why? But there's always an exit strategy. I'm producing this video right now as part of my AG credential process. My AG credentials are currently under review in Springfield, Missouri, and I'm thinking it must be getting close for me to receive them because I'm experiencing all sorts of spiritual attacks that have led me to a place of asking God why. Yet what I have learned is the question why God isn't what God requires of us. Instead, God requires us to ask, how do I overcome this, God? And the answer, almost every time, is a new dimension of faithfulness and trust in the Lord. And third, Job-like suffering grants us a new vision and a new understanding of God. Friends, you can't understand what you don't know. You won't experience what God didn't bring you to. And everything God brings you to, He brings you through. And not to sound morose, but that may indeed include standing before God's eternal throne. After all, Job himself stood before God as part of the process of his suffering. Well, there you have it. A painful blessing is a purposeful blessing. It's a blessing that requires a growing faith, and it always results in a new vision and understanding of God Himself.